Just wait a minute or two so people can come on. Okay, why don't I start? Good afternoon, everyone. I am Michal Deckel, Director of the Rifkin Center for the Humanities and the Arts here, or technically here at CCNY. The Rifkin Center, named after its patron, Simon H. Rifkin, district judge and prominent lawyer, hosts many talks and conferences during the year, and I urge you to find us on social media and to log on to our website, rifkincenter.org. The center also runs a year-long seminar around a certain theme, and this year our theme is not very original. It is pandemic. And so we are honored to host today Ian Buruma, who will be speaking about pandemic and conspiracy. Ian Buruma needs little introduction. He is among the foremost intellectuals of our time, trained in Chinese literature and Japanese cinema. He has written over 20 books about a variety of subjects, including China, Japan, the history of World War II, the limits of tolerance, a very wonderful memoir, which is a favorite of mine, Tokyo Romance, about his life as a young man in Japan. And his latest book from 2020 is The Churchill Complex, The Rise and Fall of the Special Relationship and the End of the Anglo-American Order. So Ian, it's wonderful to have you with us, and I'm turning the virtual stage to you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you, even though it's remote. I will give you a fairly brief presentation of a few points that we can then discuss at greater length. And I'd like to start with a few concrete examples of conspiracies, or at least conspiracy theories that will introduce the theme. The first one was something that happened on the 1st of September in 1923. When a terrible earthquake struck the Tokyo region in Japan, Tokyo and Yokohama, in the middle of the day when people were cooking their lunches. And so firestorms broke out and there was general panic. And in this panic, rumors were spread that the Koreans, who were an unpopular and discriminated minority in Japan, were using the opportunity of this terrible event of starting fires and poisoning wells and that kind of thing. And very soon, often encouraged by local policemen, lynch mobs were formed and attacked everybody who was suspected of being a Korean. That included people who were in Chinese clothes or Korean clothes, or who didn't pronounce the Japanese properly and seemed foreign, and so on and so forth. And thousands and thousands of people were brutally murdered in this panic. And the conspiracy was not only encouraged by local policemen, but also by right-wing politicians who not only encouraged people to go after the Koreans or anybody who was suspected of Koreans, but leftists, union leaders, and so on were assassinated at the same time. Now, this is a case of mass hysteria, which is very often part of any kind of conspiracy theory that turns violent. It's a little bit like what happened in the 14th century in Europe when there was a plague. And the plague was then used by malevolent people to blame the Jews, again, like in 1923 in Tokyo, of poisoning wells and doing other things. And again, in a very similar way, lynch mobs were formed and Jews were attacked and murdered in large numbers. So this is the mass hysterical aspect of this. More interesting to me, in a way, I mean, mass hysteria can be easily explained. It's fear, it's panic, it's infectious. People who were unpopular before are blamed, and natural inclinations to violence, which unfortunately are part of the nature of many human beings, are unleashed. More interesting intellectually to me is a phenomenon that we can see today, but doesn't mean that it's new, but we certainly see it today, which is of individuals who are converted to conspiracy theories, who are not ignorant people, but people who are often highly educated. And were not particularly conspiratorial before this mood sweeps them. And I'll give you 3 examples. 2 I've plucked from the recent news, and 1 is somebody who's known to me personally. 1 is a doctor in Britain called Dr. Andrew Wakefield. And he was conspiratorially minded before the coronavirus hit. In 2001, he was an anti-vaxxer, and he promoted the theory that vaccination for measles and mumps led to autism. He now is one of the fairly large number of people who believes that that the coronavirus has made us all victims of a giant hoax, a conspiracy by the big pharma to dupe us into buying their products in a panic. Another part of the same conspiracy theory is the idea that Bill Gates is using the vaccines to inject chips to control the world population, which is something that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. From the famous Kennedy family believes. Now, Wakefield is a doctor. He should know better, and yet he's become conspiratorial. Another example, even more peculiar in a way, given his background, is that of a man called Adam Newbold, who was a former Navy SEAL in the United States. And not only was he a Navy SEAL, but he was in charge of tracking misinformation campaigns. So he was professionally alert to all kinds of nonsense, malicious nonsense in particular, that could pose a threat to security. And one would assume that that would make him, give him a skeptical frame of mind. Now he is one of the people, again, the rather large, alarmingly large number of people who believes that the latest presidential election in the United States was stolen by a conspiracy of sinister elites. Again, not somebody whose views can be explained away by ignorance, which is, of course, the case of many people, but somebody who really should know better. The third case is a journalist whom I've known for many years, who's traveled internationally, who's been based in other countries, who's read an enormous number of books, a real intellectual, a cosmopolitan figure, and so on. Was very anti-communist at one point, but always very against all kinds of authoritarian politics, and so on, and liberal in the best sense of the word. He's now believes not only that 9/11 was a kind of Zionist conspiracy, but he believes that the plane shot down over the Ukraine, that this was a CIA operation. He believes that the coronavirus is a giant hoax led by George Soros and Bill Gates, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I won't mention his name, but the case has rather obsessed me because I know him to be a very knowledgeable and thoughtful man. And so what explains the fact that such people who know a lot, would be caught up in these kind of conspiracy theories? Why is this? Well, we can pose we have a stab at some general answers. Conspiracies are always sparked by forces that threaten us, or that we feel threaten us, that are unseen and vague and diverse, even though you can, what people sometimes do, put faces to them, like George Soros or Bill Gates, but they're hidden, they're unseen, they're vague, etc. The deep state, elites, big pharma, and so on. This is something deeply vague. That's one thing. But the other thing is that perhaps ignorance is thinking that bad or conspiratorial or delusional ideas are the result of ignorance is barking up the wrong tree. They can actually be the result of too much knowledge, or at least they can be explained more by the fact that it is precisely intellectuals who can be vulnerable to them. For I think a certain kind of conspiratorial thinking is often precise, even though it's against elites, so to speak, is in itself a kind of elitist project that is attractive to intellectuals, or people who think of themselves as intellectuals, because it assumes that they have superior knowledge. It assumes that what we're told by the mainstream press, on television, by politicians and so on, is all a smokescreen. It's all nonsense. It's all propaganda. We're being lied to by the people in power. Only a select few who know better, who have access to this kind of this secret information or that insight, initiates, are the ones who can see through the propaganda that the rest of us benighted, ignorant fools can't see. I mean, Trotskyists in the past, who had more than a bit of this, called this false consciousness. In other words, the majority of people are living in false consciousness. They're not even aware that they're being lied to, and believe things that are against their own interests. Only a select few, a kind of vanguard of people, understand how the world, especially power in the world, really works. And the more that the mainstream media or others debunk these theories, the more entrenched such thinking becomes, because it's simply seen, any attempt to prove them wrong is simply seen as evidence of the powers that be imposing their oppressive propaganda, and gives them this sense that they're constantly under siege. And this is something you find with a lot of conspiratorialists, is this sense of, not least in the United States today, with the people who believe that President Biden stole the election, is this idea of being victims, of being quote unquote canceled, being shut up, of deliberately not being heard, and so on. Which again plays into the paranoia of certain intellectuals who suffer from a sense of not having as much power as they would like anyway. There's also a religious element to this, I think. This notion, and you find it in many different religions, you find it in different kinds of Protestantism, this idea of the coming apocalypse. And the coming apocalypse, the world is doomed, the world is going under, but only a select few will not only see it coming, but will be saved. And I think this is inherent to a lot of religious thinking, and I think a lot of conspiratorial thinking of the kind that believe that we're doomed because we're being undermined by elites and deep states and so on, big pharma, has a strong religious component. And you find this both on the left and the right, but you certainly see it on the right today. And I'm sorry to be harping on this particular example all the time, but it's in our faces. Trumpism, I see much less as a political ideology than I see it as a cult. It has a strong religious component. People believe in Trump, not as a politician or because they believe that he represents the right interests or has particular political ideas that they like, but they believe in him in the way that people believe in a cult leader. Now, invisible forces, invisible powers, opaque elements that threaten us, that are an existential threat, can be many things. Nature, the forces of nature, is one obvious example. Earthquakes, viruses, we can't see them. They threaten us, we know they can kill us, but we can't put a face or a name or anything else to it, which doesn't stop us from trying to do that. But that's what makes these things particularly threatening and makes us particularly prone to try and find explanations for them. It's also not for nothing, I think, that the Nazi ideologues used biological language in their anti-Semitic ideology. They described the threat as they perceived it from Jews in biological terms. Jews were like a virus. They were viruses that were infecting the healthy organism of the Aryan races. This was a very important and very typical aspect of Nazi racism, to see it as a disease, not just as a political threat or a social threat or a cultural threat, or indeed as anti-Semitism had been in the past, a religious threat. It was seen as a kind of sickness that had to be expunged brutally. And anti-Semitism was always liable to erupt in violence, and always did at various periods during the plague and other periods. But until the 19th century, it still remained a religious prejudice. Jews, because they were associated with those who had killed Jesus Christ, had to be kept separate, had to be discriminated against as a dangerous minority. It became biological really in the late 19th century, which was the same time that Jews officially, this started a little earlier with Napoleon, but in the 19th century, Jews officially were emancipated in many European societies. They got the same rights and so on. It led to the Jewish Enlightenment. But the main result, socially speaking, is that Jews, as it were, or many Jews, non-religious Jews, became invisible. You couldn't always detect whether somebody was Jewish or not Jewish. They wore the same clothes. They spoke German or Polish or Russian or in the same way as other Poles, Germans and Russians did. You couldn't see them anymore. And this, for anti-Semites, of course, made them more dangerous and made them into this unseen force that was no longer confined to ghettos wearing strange clothes and that kind of thing, but it was an unseen force that was somehow manipulating us through media and other sinister ways. And this is where anti-Semitism became conspiratorial. This is what gave the rise to the Russian forgery, which has had such malign influence, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, this idea of this international cabal of Jews that you can't see, but they're somehow through banks, the media and so on, manipulating the world, pulling the strings behind the scenes, and which is very close to notions of the sinister deep state, of international elites, etc., etc., etc. This all comes from this same fear, I think, of unseen forces. Political or historical events that are difficult to explain or seem to many people to be inexplicable can lead to similar mindsets. Germans at the end of World War I were consistently told that they were going to win the war, that their military was stronger than the military of other nations, that there was no way Germany could lose the war. So when Germany did lose the war in 1918, something had to be blamed on this. And again, it became these unseen forces. It was the stab in the back by liberals, by socialists, by communists, by Jews. Who'd stabbed Germany in the back, which meant that Germany lost the war because of a conspiracy, because of an enemy within, rather than the fact that the Western allies, when the Americans came in particularly, prevailed. And we see similar things, I think, happening in our own time. Now, another element to be considered and that we can discuss later is the nature of information. I think conspiracy theories traditionally thrive when there is a lack of information, a lack of transparency, which makes, again, power seem more sinister because it's secret. The more power is exercised in secrecy, the more likely it is that people will come up with conspiracy theories because they have to explain something that is unknown, unknowable, and unseen. When they're dark about power, how power is used, we have to make things up. We have to try and explain it in our own ways by giving it names, by coming up with conspiracies. And the names could be George Soros, it could be the CIA, it can be Jews, it could be whatever one wishes to use. It gives us a sense that we can somehow have some kind of control over the forces that seem to exercise power over us because we can explain it. We know where it comes from. However delusional our explanations may be. In our own time, or at least in certain countries, in democratic countries, it seems to be the other way around. It's not the lack of information that is causing confusion. It's too much information. That with the fracturing of the media on the internet, we get bombarded with information. But this has caused a great shift in the way information works, because instead of having the information coming through certain mainstream sources that are generally trusted, Walter Cronkite appearing on the television news, or the New York Times and so on, which more or less dictated the way, and I don't use dictated in a particularly malignant sense, but more or less dictated the way people receive their information. People who read provincial, local newspapers or listened to local radio, the information they got was filtered through mainstream media, such as the New York Times, who had editors and so on, who tried as best they could to sift the complete nonsense from the truth, which doesn't mean that everything they printed, even though they have been fit, but really was true, or that they didn't have their different political interests didn't come into play and so on. But there was a barrier between total nonsense and things that at least could had some claim to be true, and there was a sort of, despite political differences, there was more or less a consensus that certain sources of information could be trusted and others couldn't. Now this has changed, obviously, and now the information we get from mainstream sources are becoming less and less influential and important. And we get our information from millions and millions of sources, thousands or more than thousands of little bubbles, which are completely unchecked, unfiltered, and unverifiable. And more people are in bubbles, and each bubble can contain its own madness. Now, there's another theory about this, which I think is persuasive, which is that we live in an age where extreme individualism is fostered. The idea that every individual as a consumer is king. And the social media, especially with its likes and its dislikes and its algorithms and so on, give individuals the sense that somehow they're controlling their world, if not the universe. At the same time, individuals faced with reality cannot but conclude that their influence on the way that the world moves is extremely limited to, and in fact, probably almost none. And this possibly fosters the kind of impotence, a sense of impotence and the sense of frustration that leads some people into this world of conspiracy, of being victims of unseen forces, of being victims of deep states and sinister elites, and so on and so forth. Now, there's not very much we can do about the propensity of human beings to be fearful, of other arrogant human beings to think that they have access to a truth that others don't. These things will always be with us, but we must be thinking, and I'll leave you with this, with a question rather than with a clear opinion or a solution, but we must find some way, I think, to control the way or filter the way people receive information. We must find some way back to making sure that we don't end up in a world in which a million fantasies thrive. We have to find some way to make sure not only that we get to the truth and know more and more and better how power is exercised over us, which is a necessary condition for any liberal democracy to function, but we also have to find a way to regain the trust of people in that certain sources of information are more reliable than others. And that means that the internet has to be edited, and that the filtering process that goes on in more or less reliable traditional media can be replicated on the internet. Now, if you ask me how this is to be done, then I'm afraid I won't be able to give you a clear or glib answer. But I'll leave you with this and hope that the rest of this session will come up with some answers that I haven't given you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ian, for this really great synthesis of a lot of ideas about past and present. So I invite people to write their questions in the Q&A. We have one question, but maybe I'll start with my own. And I should say that so as I told you before, I'm in Israel right now, and the situation here is there's an excess of vaccines. So they're sort of begging people to become vaccinated, and there is a segment of the population that just won't agree to be vaccinated. And one of the interesting, nice things is that there's a kind of satirical program that goes on every day at night, and they had this whole satire where they're trying to convince people, and they're saying, no, look, but if my shaman tells me to drink frog's blood, then I know what's in there. I know that there's blood and there is frogs, but this Pfizer, who knows what Pfizer put in my vaccine? And that's really, I think, the sentiment for a lot of people. But my question to you is this. I'm wondering what you think is the role of post-structuralist theory and its influence on the way we think in present day conspiratorial thinking, because I think we have become accustomed to, and students have become accustomed to a kind of paranoid thinking where you're always looking for, what is underneath, what is hidden, you're exposing something. And I'm wondering how much it lends to present day conspiratorial thinking, and then how much it seeps then into the right today.
Yes, well, that's a very interesting question, and I don't think it's I think it's very difficult to establish a clear link. Most people who believe that Donald Trump is a messiah and that the election was stolen from him will not have read Derrida. But there is a link in the sense that the post-structuralists had developed this theory, which cannot be completely dismissed, obviously, that every form of truth is a product of power. In other words, that there is no such thing as absolute truth, but all truth is, or every claim to truth somehow reflects one's position in a power structure. Now, I think it would go much too far to say that these theories somehow explain the paranoia, the political paranoia of our own time, since these forms of paranoia go back probably to the caves or the times that people lived in caves. But I think it did unintentionally create an intellectual climate in which it becomes harder, perhaps, for people who think about these things to criticize it, because the power of intellectuals always has been limited, and that's probably a good thing. On the other hand, the one role that intellectuals do have and should have is to be the critics of received opinion. And I think it becomes a problem if received opinion too clearly starts to reflect some of the received opinion in the academy as well, even though the academy had no intention of fomenting the kind of paranoia that's now prevalent on the right. So I think there may be, the connection may be there.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think so too. I mean, I think people don't read Derrida necessarily, they don't read Foucault necessarily, but those works sort of have seeped into popular culture. You don't need to read them to think in this way. So we have a few questions. The first question, first of all, somebody is agreeing with you on the religious aspect of Trumpism, and this person is asking whether you believe that the suspension of Trump's social media megaphones will cure us of his ill, or will his children run for Congress, or I guess if there will be, I mean, in other words, will this be a cure, or will this just be, is this a kind of temporary solution?
Very difficult to say, because the question, I think, then is, to what extent is the cult leader essential for a cult to persist? And you could argue that without the leader, or without the leader having any power, the cult itself will wither. That is possible. If Hitler had been assassinated in 1936, history would have been different. But that doesn't mean that his myth would not have had a life. And as we know from religious cults, often a martyred leader can become much more powerful than the person ever was when he was alive. And we know from history there's one very clear example of this, and his name was Jesus Christ. And so it's hard to tell. I think I would expect if Donald Trump were no longer to play any significant political role, probably a core of the really Trumpist believers would perhaps shrink. But I think what he's been promoting, what he's whipped up, is not going to disappear for a long time, because he was playing with forces that are, or he was exploiting forces, fears that are real.
We have another question. I'm just going to read it. How can we combat conspiracy theories within communities of color that have formed a strong distrust towards the government due to many wrongdoings in the past?
Yeah, that's extremely important. Something that the press is, or at least the New York Times, is rather shy about emphasizing is that they talk a lot about how white people are getting vaccinations much quicker and in larger numbers than members of minorities, especially African Americans, which statistically is clearly true. But one of the reasons appears to be a great reluctance, or far greater reluctance, amongst African Americans to get vaccinated than white people. And the reluctance is clearly, well, one clear explanation is that the past governments have used medical experiments and that kind of thing in a malign way on minorities. But I think the distrust goes deeper than that. I think it's not just the bad behavior of governments. I think it's a general distrust of authority. And if you take the view or instinctively feel that you're prey to being manipulated by the sinister forces of white dominated government, you're not going to believe anything they say, and least of all to be injected with things that you have no idea what they are, and so on. Now the question, how do you rectify that? I don't have an easy answer, because it's like all conspiracy theories. The more you try and rectify it by coming up with rational explanations on why those theories are wrong, the more it'll be seen as yet another form of manipulation.
I'm reading another question. Control of internet expression and the dissemination of opinions is in private hands: Facebook, commercial news services, private websites, etc. How then can democratic governments bring about something analogous to the fairness doctrine to pierce these private bubbles and regain some ability to provide some shared epistemic media environment?
Well, I mean, governments can make laws, and they can. It's like all problems of free speech. Different governments have different ways of approaching this issue. The United States has the First Amendment, and so here you can legally say all kinds of things that you couldn't in other democracies. European countries have stricter laws on what can be said than the United States. And on the other hand, in the United States, there's probably more informal social censorship of what people say or write than is true of a country like France or even Britain. But I think governments can come up with rules that can make the internet slightly less of a free-for-all than they are now.
Somebody's asking, how can people help friends or relatives who have fallen down conspiracy theory rabbit holes? I guess you just talked about your own friend. Is there anything we can do?
No, is probably the answer. I don't think so. I mean, it's like, you know, if the person you live with suddenly becomes a fervent believer in a cult, it's very difficult, I think, because I don't think rational argument reaches them, because it's essentially an irrational world that they're moving into. And so reasoned argument is not going to do it. So again, I'm afraid this is becoming a refrain, but I don't have an easy answer to this question.
What is the role of affirmation in conspiracy theories in the contemporary world, insofar as the internet enables us to focus in on whatever it is we already believe in and find like-minded people? And I think this question of community is a big one as well.
What exactly is the question?
The question is, if you're, let's say you're on Facebook,
Yes.
you already, because of the algorithms, you're already getting an affirmation of the things you believe in, because
Yes.
you're matched with people that you believe in the same things that you do. So what is the role of this kind of affirmation echo chamber, I guess?
Well, that is, it seems to me more a statement than a question, but I agree with the statement. I mean, that is indeed a huge problem. Now, to what extent, the question then is, to what extent is this different from the way things traditionally were? Because in the past, if people were in Europe as well as the United States, almost everybody would have been part of an organized faith. And if you were a Roman Catholic, you would be, most of your information would have come from other Roman Catholics, not least, of course, first of all, from the priests, but also from Catholic publications and so on. And so people's beliefs always were affirmed by what they heard or read. But I think one difference is that until recently in the modern media, in the 20th century media, even in the 19th century perhaps, but certainly in the 20th century, there was an attempt to show different points of view in opinion pages and so on. So if you read a serious newspaper, you wouldn't just be exposed to one monolithic ideological view. You would still come across different views, and there was debate, and the media offered possibilities for debate and differences of opinion to compete and so on. And on television, you still have, to some extent, it's become more and more ritualistic, but you have debate programs and so on. So one would be exposed to this. On the internet, you can live a life completely unexposed to different views. And I think that is indeed a difference between the way many people received their opinion on the internet and the way they did when they relied on newspapers and television.
One of our responders would like to know more about your example of the 1923 earthquake, and is asking basically why exactly, I mean, what he's saying is that usually when we think about conspiracy theories, we think about QAnon and other things. Here you're linking it to something like to the pogroms maybe, and to the earthquake. And he's asking if you could say more about why you see these phenomena as related and why it's useful to think about them as related.
Well, I think where they're related is that something dreadful happens, like an earthquake or a plague, and people then need to somehow find something to blame it on. It's not just one of those things that happens that is terrible you cope with, which is of course the way you should view these things, but you can't deal with it if you can't blame it on somebody or something. And I think what happened in 23 and what happened during the plague in the 14th century, that if you could blame something, some aspect of it, even if it's the most visible results of these natural phenomena, like the firestorm in 1923 in Tokyo, if you can blame that on Koreans who've set things on fire, somehow it becomes easier. There's an explanation. And I think it's a truism to say that if you feel threatened by something, you can cope with it more easily if you can explain it. Then if it remains an unseen force, it's more frightening. And the easiest thing is to blame it on an already distrusted minority.
My colleague Harold Wieser is asking, or rather saying, first of all, in response to my question about theory, he's saying basically, basically theory and it's, maybe I'll actually read what he's saying. He's saying theory's impact on popular methods of reading for absences, the tension between logic and rhetoric, the absolute necessity of constitutive blindness that renders every text or every attempt to say something completely unaware of its own enabling self-contradictions, and so on. He's saying basically these have saved my life. I couldn't have lived without them. Do popular conspiracy theories get from theory a toleration for their own blatant contradictions?
No, I don't think so, because again, they don't read theory. Many of them, most of them, don't read theory. They're probably not even aware of it. Also, even though I myself am not a fan of most theoretical writing, it goes over my head, and much of it bores me. I don't wish to dismiss it. I think that a lot of theorists have helped us to think more clearly, the best of them, helped us think more critically. And as so often with interesting theory, even though much of what a particular theory promotes might be considered to be nonsense, it can contain insights that are very important. And I think that's true of a lot of theories that have somehow lasted longer than 5 minutes, that a lot of what these theories said was bullshit, but they contained an insight that was very important. And I think we shouldn't dismiss that. But I think the problem, or the influence of the theories, these particular theories, and the paranoia that we're seeing today is not direct. It's not that people read it and therefore became paranoid. It's that I think it weakened the intellectual classes in their capacity to criticize it.
Ian, do you have any thoughts about how restraints on information flow should be structured so that they don't become instruments of power? Professor Wilner is saying, whenever I read about madness on the right today and wish to control it, my thinking goes back to McCarthyism.
Let me think about that. I mean, that's a complicated question, because you could argue there's even in publications that were serious and which did do their best to present some semblance of the truth, you can't deny that there was some link with power. I mean, one argument for the capitalist approach to the media is that it avoids direct political power. In other words, if news media are owned by businessmen whose main interest is in making money out of them, then what you then avoid is that you have a political party that dictates what goes into these news media. The only concern then is that they make money, and then the editors, and then they can have a particular political view. But as long as the owners don't directly dictate what goes into the papers or programs or whatever it is, it can still be relatively politically independent. I mean, it's an argument, and some people would no doubt criticize it, but there's something to be said for that. But that did mean that the owners did have a certain kind of power. So there's always some power involved. And having said this, I've now lost the meaning of the original question. What was the question again?
The original question is that, I mean, you spoke about, I guess, legislature and the fact that we need to somehow control the information that we get. And I guess Professor Wilner is asking me, can we do that without falling into a kind of a worse?
giving either governments or private companies too much power into censoring the content.
Exactly.
Yes, no, that's a very tough one. Well, if you think of the example of the United States, until I think it was until the Reagan administration that there was a rule with the media that they had to present different points of view. And that was abolished, and anybody could present any view they wanted after that. So the government clearly did have a role in the way that the public media were being directed. I don't think personally it should be left to the private companies. I don't think it should be left to Facebook or any of those companies to censor content, because they're not doing it. They can't be. They're not the representatives of citizens of a democracy. It can only be done by those who've been elected, and so I do think it has to come from governments. And it probably does mean that they have to be, when it comes to rules on free speech, have to rethink it a little bit. Exactly how, I don't know. But it would not be the first time that governments always have been involved in interpretations of free speech and how it should be umpired, and we just have to think of new ways in which they can do it. But so the only clear answer I can give to this question is that I think it does need government thinking and intervention, and it should not be left to the companies.
Somebody's asking, in a professional setting, in social work, healthcare workers, I guess psychologists, how do you believe people should respond to misinformation provided by their clients, patients?
I would need an example to be. I'm not quite sure what the misinformation, what kind of misinformation, and from whom.
I mean, I can imagine, clients of a social worker who's saying, I won't be vaccinated because they're trying to poison me or whatnot. Example, okay, here's an example. Patient suffering from COVID-19 who does not believe in COVID.
And then the question is, how should a doctor or a caregiver respond to that?
Yes.
Well, if the person who has COVID but denies he has COVID or she has COVID, there's nothing very much you can do about that. I think, again, it's a bit like the earlier question of what can governments do. I think whatever people think, whether they think COVID is a hoax or whether they think it exists or whether they have it or they don't have it, you can establish rules on how people should behave. And if a government says that in order to stop the spread of a disease, wearing masks is mandatory, it doesn't matter what people think. They will have to fall into line. And so I don't think the answer there is to try and convince people who believe that COVID is a hoax of the opposite. You establish rules in how people should behave in order to stop the disease.
And you suggest an affinity between religion and conspiracy theories. And I'm wondering, or this person is wondering, and I'm wondering as well, how far you would push that affinity.
Well, that's a rather vague question. I mean, and it's not something you can put a mathematical answer with mathematical precision. I think an awful lot of, you can point to a lot of things that are not overtly religious in the sense that people gather together in a particular spot and worship a god and pray and so on. There are religious ways of thinking based on shared beliefs, on trying to, on seeing unbelievers as sinful, etc., etc., that you could define as religious ways of thought or religious attitudes, without being able to say, to pin it to to a particular religious faith. So I think something that you could define as a religious cult is something that is based on an irrational belief that is impervious to reason, and that very often excludes or distinguishes believers from non-believers in a moral sense. In other words, that those who believe are moral human beings and those who don't are not.
Several people are writing, I think, in a kind of desperation, I think, as we all feel, how can we scale this back, right? I mean, because there is already such a level of distrust, because in fact governments have been involved in information censoring, and communities of color especially have suffered greatly. Where is the balance? How do you scale back from that? The same goes for mistrusting mainstream media, because there's been things that have been withheld. So how can we find our way back? How can we decide who is trustworthy? I mean, we know that what's wrong, but how can, I mean, we can't really imagine, I think, going back to, as you said, a kind of very much more centralized media, but what can we do in the current situation?
Well, it's a complicated question, and again, it's too complicated to give a glib answer. I think I can only answer it by complicated, perhaps a little even more, which is that the confidence is rarely the confidence in elites, in any elites, and whether it's newspaper editors or whether it's politicians or doctors or professors, that we no longer believe, and this again is partly driven or boosted by the internet, where there is so much information now that it's difficult to feel that anybody who can Google anything is any less informed than an expert. And experts in the past and the expertise of elites was protected by a certain amount of mumbo jumbo and secrecy. It used to be a joke that whenever doctors wrote out a prescription, they would do it in script that was so illegible that non-doctors couldn't make sense of it. Or before that would even write down their prescriptions in Latin. The same with priests before they changed the rules in the Catholic Church, that anybody who didn't understand Latin wouldn't be able to understand what priests said. And this was a way of protecting the authority of your group. You could say in modern terms, and this comes back to the question about theory, that one reason so many academic texts are so obscure that the non-initiate can't possibly make sense of it is analogous to the priests using Latin. And there was a way to protect the authority of the academic elite from those who would question its authority. And so there are many good reasons to argue that it was a good thing to challenge elites, to challenge elitist thinking. It was a democratizing force. The problem is that it's difficult to see how a liberal democracy, which after all is democracy of the people represented by elites, that we delegate in a liberal democracy, in a representative democracy, we delegate a lot of power to representatives that we choose. But those representatives, of course, are an elite. And unless you believe in direct democracy, which a lot of people on the right are now persuaded of, which is democracy by referendum, the idea that the voice of the people has to be heard immediately without mediation of representatives, of elites. Fascism comes from the same notion, that the voice of the people has to be, is represented by the leader, the dictator, and unmediated by parliaments and other such institutions which stand between the people, the mass of the people, and power. Now, those are elites, and if we no longer, and they're no longer trusted. And I think this is actually a threat to our democracies. If we don't trust, if we think all politicians are basically gangsters, and all editors are liars, and so on, then the logical conclusion is that the voice of the people can only be represented by great leaders. And that, of course, is Trumpism. And so somehow we'll have to find a way back to trusting people that represent us, that we can that we trust with power, whether it's in the media or whether it's in politics. And again, we don't have enough time, and I don't have enough knowledge to be able to give clear answers to how we can do that. But I do think we have to go back to something like that.
I agree. There's one more optimistic person who's writing, don't conspiracy theories generally just fizzle out? Maybe we should just, maybe they reemerge, but in the future, but perhaps the best strategy is just to try and wait them out. Or do we have to actively fight them?
Yes, but they can, like epidemics, they can come back at any time. And again, I don't want to harp on that, but I mean, think of how tenacious the distrust of Jews has been in history. I mean, and it comes back even in countries where there are hardly any Jews left. And so, and similar conspiracy theories can come back in different guises, but they can be very tenacious. Yes, certain kinds of nonsense disappear, but then they reappear in another way. So the phenomenon of conspiratorial thinking, like everything else that is human, I think will be with us forever. The question is, how do you control it? How do you make sure it doesn't become dominant and lead to violence?
Is conspiratorial thinking always irrational? To what extent may the protest or skepticism it expresses be legitimate, however misdirected?
Well, what is legitimate but misdirected? If something is real, then by definition, at least in my definition, it wouldn't be a conspiracy theory. So if you can point to a real conspiracy, whether it's political or anything else, and there are conspiracies. I mean, there are people who banded together to further a particular cause. And if you can show that this is the case, it's no longer a conspiracy theory, it's a conspiracy. So we're talking about theories which usually are beyond proof and therefore almost by definition irrational.
Gaslighting seems to be a key component of Trump's manipulation of his followers. This feels more than blame, as it is literally accusing others of what he himself is guilty of and setting up an alternative reality. Is this new to this particular cult, or has that been a trait through the years?
No, I think that's not new. After all, that's what Freudians call projection. which is a very common human phenomenon, that you blame others for your own most prominent weaknesses. This is not new, and offering an alternative reality in order to attract followers and bolster your own power in one way or another were probably always an element of the way in which power was exercised. So I don't think Trumpism is a unique or new phenomenon.
Somebody's saying if you could speak to the notion of popular skepticism towards institutions of government, and so popular skepticism that transcends conspiratorial thinking. For example, the notions that are mistrust in politicians and the fact that we think many times that they're fundamentally self-serving. Where did that come from? And how has that stroked the conspiratorial fires?
Well, it's not bad to be skeptical. I think we should always be skeptical, but there's a difference between skepticism and fundamental distrust. If we feel that we can't trust a particular politician, in a democracy, we then have the option to vote him or her out. But that's not the same thing. And I think we should be skeptical enough that we should always be open to the fact that certain politicians deserve to be voted out. The same is true with all authority. If you go to a doctor and the doctor tells you something that you feel cannot be right, you go for a second opinion. But that isn't to say that you should go to the doctor already having made up your mind that doctors can't be trusted, because then there's no point in going to see the doctor in the first place. So being critical or skeptical is not the same thing as starting off with the notion that an authority can't be trusted by definition.
This is just an example, because somebody is asking, how do you understand the distrust of the Warren Commission and the belief of conspiracy to assassinate JFK?
How do I understand it? Oh, I never delved in it deeply enough, and when I delved in it at all, it was a long time ago. So I don't have a real answer to that question, really. I'm agnostic on that. I'm an agnostic on that.
I have to say that what's interesting, what seems to be working in Israel against anti-vaccinators of all groups is giving people food, offering food to people to come to be vaccinated. It's had tremendous success. Something as fundamental as that. So not trying to convince, not arguing, simply sort of wrapping people in, I guess, in nourishment.
Yes, I could see that. I mean, the other thing which I didn't say in answer to that question, it of course does help when trusted members of the community in which such distrust is particularly strong. If such people, by example, show another view, that can be a big help. So that's probably would be one of the most effective ways. And you know, there are examples of it. I mean, there are examples of prominent African Americans, for example, who make sure that everybody sees that they believe in getting vaccinated. And I think that's much more convincing than, you know, if I would say it.
Right. So I guess few people are basically reacting to your, I guess, basic idea that somehow information needs to be controlled in some way, and there's being somewhat skeptical about it, saying basically what you're saying is that we need a vaccine or to immunize us against some kind of reoccurrence. But how can that happen? Won't conspiracy theories always be with us, or just below the surface? Whatever. I mean, can we really? I guess people are saying, can we really do anything about it? Since historically they've always been here and they will continue to be with us.
Well, I would agree with that. The question is, how do you limit the damage? And that has everything to do with the way people receive their information. And one thing one could hope is that most people do not a priori prefer to listen to lies than to truth. And that media that have traditionally been successful or most successful have been those that are most trusted with presenting the truth. And one must hope that people will feel the same way about information when almost all of it will come through our computer screens, and will be attracted to certain news websites, whether they're called the New York Times or anything else. They'll be attracted to those which will have editors, which will have people who will sift and choose and use their judgment on the content, and will prefer to read those than websites run by lunatics. And the websites run by lunatics will exist, but will attract less attention, just as in the pre-internet age, lunatics could publish pamphlets, but few people would read them, whereas many more people would read serious newspapers or watch serious programs or hear them on the radio. And so one must hope that this will be replicated on the internet.
Yes. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, your examples of the three examples of the people that you brought as example who were educated people. You make all of this very problematic, because you would think that if we revitalize our education system, especially our public education system, then we would be in better shape, but perhaps not, right?
Well, I think we would be in better shape. It would not solve every problem, but I do believe that in times when public education was much better funded than it is today, certainly in the United States, that the country was in better shape, culturally and politically. So I would certainly argue for that. But will that solve all these problems? Will it get rid of all paranoia? No.
Maybe we'll do maybe one or two more questions and let you go. Is holding a conspiracy theory, if holding a conspiracy theory is a belief, how can facts be antidotal?
Well, they can't. You can't argue, you can't convince a true believer in something that is beyond proof. You can't argue them out of that by presenting proof. It's like atheists who think that you can argue against somebody who believes in God, that you can argue them out of that position by trying to prove that God doesn't exist. It's beyond proof. So you can't, and since you can't prove the contrary, you won't be able to convince a believer. Because believers, religious believers, by definition, believe in something that's beyond proof. A believer in God does not believe in God because the believer can prove that God exists. They don't claim that they can prove that God exists. They believe that God exists. And so that's beyond rational argument, which is my problem with atheists. I mean, atheism is an ideology, and I think it's a flawed ideology. And I say that without believing in any religion myself.
Let's see. Yes. Have you, let's see. I don't think anyone has brought up the timing of editing, filtering the internet. The unfortunate fact is that half of the federal government has proven themselves to be extremists, most of them followers of the cult leader. So how can we expect them to be reasonable regarding the filtering of information? If we
We
delay
can't.
it, yeah.
We can't, as it stands now. Sorry, the question went on.
No, if we delay it, the extremism only increases and the cycle is further compounded. When we do, how do we stop in to filter the information? So in other words, I mean, I guess this goes back to a question that several people have asked is how do we make sure that the censoring and the editing and the filtering doesn't fall into the wrong hands as well? And it would.
That's a perfectly valid question. It's a perfectly valid question. I mean, governments have done various things in the past to regulate media. There are various ways you can regulate. And I think they could come up with ways to do it again in the internet age. The other thing is commercial, that more editors, and it's already happening, but there would be more editors on websites, on internet information, good editors, if they could make a living at it. And it would attract talented people who could do the jobs that are now done by editors in traditional media, but online. It's still an uphill battle because online journalism is still too badly paid to make it worth many people's while to do it, but that could change. And I think once that changes, things will look less bleak.
I think we will end here. Let you go because it's been kind of a lot of talking, but this was incredibly insightful and interesting and timely, and I guess something that we will continue talking about, whether off or on the internet. Thank you very much, Ian, for joining us.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.